Hello, welcome to the Spotlight. I'm your host, Behrouz Najafi. U.S. President Joe Biden will be traveling to Saudi Arabia and Israel this week for his first official visit to the region since taking office. Now, ahead of the controversial visit, we will dissect the failures that the U.S. has experienced in its foreign policy in this region in the past several years. Now, my guests for tonight's episode of the Spotlight are journalist and political analyst Elijah Magnier, who's joining us out of Marseille, France. Also with us will be journalist and author Daniel Lazare. He's in New York. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Good to see you. Now over to Marseille. Elijah, let's begin with Syria. You know, just last week we had this report that American forces were escorting a number of tankers. They were stealing actually, Syrian oil out of the country. So also, you know, Washington tried to oust the president in Syria by, you know, backing terrorists, but to no avail. So the question is, what was the reason for Washington and also its regional and NATO allies' failure to meet their objectives in Syria?
Thank you for having me.
Sure thing.
It's obvious that President Joe Biden has no policy or strategy to adopt in Syria, but following exactly what Donald Trump has established by occupying northeast Syria and stealing the oil. Furthermore, he blocked the road between on the borders of Tanaf between Syria and Iraq to cripple the Syrian economy and continue imposing the Caesar Act sanctions, very harsh sanctions on Syria to cripple the economy and to hit the population, because sanctions are always against the population, regime or government. Therefore, we can understand that Biden doesn't have any strategy in the Middle East, doesn't have any clear strategy in Syria. It is indeed stealing the oil, particularly in this moment where the war in Ukraine is weighing very heavily on the West and is creating a shortage of energy and an increase of prices. Although in Iraq, too, Biden is not in the best position, where the Iraqi parliament has asked him to leave the country and for the US forces to end their presence according to a clear decision by the Iraqi people. And yet we still see the Americans are still in Iraq, are still in Syria. They're not leaving against the will of the population, right, because Biden simply doesn't have any strategy.
Okay, we'll come to Iraq also on this show. Okay, now let me ask Daniel about another country in this region where the U.S. foreign policy has failed, Afghanistan. Just recently, you know, the forces that were supposed to achieve the stated goal of nation building, they left that country in ruins. And for the United States, the war in Afghanistan was the most protracted one in history, you know, 20 years, longer than World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. So what do you think the reason is for the U.S. failure in Afghanistan?
It's a very good question, and the answer is there really is no answer. I mean, the U.S. went into Afghanistan after 9/11 merely to demonstrate that it could, as a show of force. It didn't have to. It was on a campaign to demonstrate that it would not stand for any more terrorist attacks, but it did so by waging war against a government that was only peripherally involved in 9/11. So there was no good reason. It was just a pointless display of force. And once the U.S. got in there, there was no getting out. So the U.S. spent 20 years, it's astonishing. The U.S. spent 20 years essentially trying to figure out what to do next. And in the process, when it was all finished and was finally lost control and was finally forced out, it left the country in far worse shape than it found it. So, so over the course of 20 years, from 1978, when the U.S. started funneling aid to the Afghan Mujahideen, to mid-2021, when it was finally forced to leave, the U.S. just pummeled that country, destroyed it. leveled, one attack after the other. First, in order to dislodge the Soviets, and then secondly, just to sort of show that it was, the biggest, most powerful military power in the area. It's a completely bizarre process that historians will be scratching their head over, I guarantee, for generations to come.
Okay. Now, Elijah, you talked about Iraq, so I was going to also ask you about Iraq, and let's now explore the reason or reasons why the Iraqi parliamentarians are wary of U.S.-led force in their country. They want them out.
For the simple reason, because the Americans have violated every single mandate and agreement signed with the Iraqi government. They're not supposed to send drones, they're not supposed to fly over Iraq or do any military act without the coordination with the Iraqi military and the Iraqi army, and at least the chief of the Iraqi army, that is the prime minister. And we have seen how Donald Trump ignored completely the prime minister of Iraq then, Adel Abdel Mahdi, when the defense minister, Minister Esper, used to call Abdel Mahdi and say, we're going to strike your forces at this point in 20 minutes. And then the prime minister would say, well, you have no right. He said, I'm not asking your authorization. I'm just informing you what we are going to do. The US forces killed dozens of Iraqi security forces by bombing their positions. Furthermore, they've killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani when he was acting as an ambassador and an advisor to Iraq. And he came to Iraq to the request of the prime minister, again putting Iraq in a very weird position between with Iran, where an ambassador and a general is killed on its territory without the knowledge of the Iraqi. So all these violations that continued throughout the years with the American on Iraqi soil, and then the Iraqi army is trained enough and capable with the Hashd Shabi to counter ISIS and all the Takfiri. There is no more reason for the American forces to remain. So now they are illegally in the country.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Elijah, that General Soleimani was not a regular general. He was also helping the Iraqis get rid of Daesh. Okay, Daniel, during the presidential campaign in his early days at the Oval Office, Joe Biden used to call Saudi Arabia a pariah state, and he planned to recalibrate and look into U.S. relations with the Arab monarchy. And, Saudi Arabia has been behind 9/11 attacks. It has a long list of human rights violations recorded. So what's the reason for Biden's turnabout? Well,
really, it's oil. Actually, it's two things. It's oil, it's control of the Persian Gulf, and it's Iran. Three things. Essentially, the U.S. has been in a partnership with Saudi Arabia since February 1945, when Franklin D. Roosevelt had his famous meeting with King Ibn Saud on the Great Salt Lake in the Suez Canal. The U.S. gave the Saudis an unqualified guarantee of security in exchange for their oil. And over the years, Saudi Arabia has turned that security guarantee into an all-purpose carte blanche to attack whatever country it sees fit. So therefore, Saudi Arabia has attacked Yemen. It has fostered a proxy war in Syria. It is threatened to invade Qatar. And the U.S. essentially has done nothing to stop it. It's even encouraged it at various points.
Now, Elijah, also we have U.S.-made weapons that are being used by Saudi mercenaries to take the life of Yemeni women and children. And still, the U.S. keeps selling them weapons. And 7-8 years pass, and Saudis and their allies, including the U.S., have failed to bring the impoverished nation and the Yemenis to their knees, haven't they?
President Biden failed in all his promises and lied about everything he said during his campaign. Because although he pledged to make Saudi Arabia a pariah and promised to teach dictators a lesson not to supply arms to Saudis and to stop the Saudi war on Yemen, and to comply with the JCPOA. He has done nothing of all that. He's going to supply weapons to Saudi Arabia. The ceasefire is really hectic in Yemen, and still Yemen is as poor as it was before 18 months when he took power. And there is no JCPOA that has been implemented so far. So whatever Biden said he's going to do, he's not doing it. And as your guest rightly said, he's coming for the oil, but not for the security in the Persian Gulf, because the security in the Persian Gulf is looked after by its own people and country. And we have seen how the Americans, the British, the Israeli, and the Greek failed to impose their will on Iran in the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran showed that it is Iran that is in control of 19% of the world energy that goes through that passage. Therefore, what Biden said, that the water is very important for the Americans and its allies to keep control of it, is against a mockery, because he's not in control of the water in the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm. Now, Daniel, let's talk a little bit now about the Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA. You know, marathon talks between Iran, the U.S., and its European allies resulted in what many called a landmark deal. And the U.S. simply scrapped it. And it even threatened other parties not to follow, not to abide by the deal. And this is another failure on the diplomatic front, isn't it?
Oh, it's a failure. It is a colossal foul-up. And Biden's attitude has been ridiculous. I mean, Biden is just utterly contemptible. The Democrats attacked Donald Trump when he walked away from the treaty in May 2018. They vowed to restore the treaty, which, after all, was negotiated by Barack Obama and Joe Biden back in 2015. So it's Joe Biden's handiwork. But then when Joe Biden came into office and began negotiations with Iran, he introduced additional demands which were completely outside the purview of the JCPOA, which he knew that Iran could not possibly abide by. Mm-hmm. So Biden, after calling for the restoration of the treaty that he and Barack Obama negotiated, set about sabotaging those negotiations. It's completely ridiculous. And as a result, military tensions are rising. The possibility of some kind of military engagement is increasing in that region. You know, and the treaty itself was keeping the peace. It was doing its job. Iran, according to all reports, was abiding faithfully by its terms. It was the U.S. which sabotaged that agreement.
Mm-hmm. Elijah, let's also have your thoughts on the JCPOA.
Well, there is a very good point here not to forget, and it used to go, and people are unaware of, is that Barack Obama and Joe Biden in 2015 did not implement the JCPOA. They implemented some part of it, and Obama instructed all the banks not to deal with Iran. So the habit of no compliance by the US goes back from the moment that the JCPOA was signed, and is not new to the Americans to revoke their signature and their promises and the international treaty. So what Donald Trump did is he dismantled the 2015 that was not fully implemented, and today Joe Biden is walking along the same road as Barack Obama, not implementing fully the JCPOA, and Donald Trump rejecting it completely and trying to postpone it. Let's see after this trip, because now he's promoting a narrative saying the real enemy is Iran, which is very boring and old and is no longer valid, because people, the country, the government and the regime and the Middle East are meeting together and are talking and do not consider Iran as the enemy they should fight, because they tried all kind of war in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq, and this language has failed, is behind us.
Daniel, the U.S. So-called maximum pressure campaign against Iran failed to bring its intended results. That was breaking Tehran's will. Iran resisted what American officials themselves called the most crippling sanctions ever. And Iran even made headways in its peaceful nuclear technology and nanotechnology and defense industry and other areas. Let's have your take on that.
Well, yes. Sanctions never really work as promised. They're a very blunt instrument. They end up hurting the mass of the population more than they affect the economic elite. And they often, curiously enough, have strangely positive side effects. For example, Iran, because its international trade was restricted, essentially was forced to diversify its economy and to concentrate on building its economy up. And as a result, Iran has now the most diverse economy in the Persian Gulf region. Certainly 1,000 times more than Saudi Arabia, which is just a economic basket case. So, as with Russia, these sanctions tend to backfire. The U.S., always brags about them, uses them. I think the U.S. has sanctions against 30 countries at this point, but they're just never as effective as they are supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Elijah, there is another country in the region, Lebanon, that's also been feeling this pinch of U.S. sanctions and interference. Let's talk a little bit about Lebanon and what the U.S. has been doing there.
The U.S. has been trying to break Lebanon's back economically and to make sure that Lebanon doesn't represent a danger to Israel any longer. Because of the presence of the resistance in Lebanon, the country is resisting any deal with Israel over the maritime borders, that Israel wants to take a chunk of the Lebanese wealth and on the border between Palestine and Lebanon. So because of the rejection of Lebanon to submit to the U.S. dictate, and because the U.S. is not a valid partner for peace and a good negotiator, this is why Lebanon refused to sign the deal with the Israelis indirectly. Therefore, the Americans turned the population and tried to turn the population against the resistance that is Hezbollah. Luckily, it has failed because the root cause of all the financial problems in Lebanon are all from the U.S. allies who stole the money and the wealth of the country, encouraged by the Americans who put heavy debts on Lebanon and dry out all the dollars from the Lebanese market to make sure that the Lebanese currency will fall into bits. And the Americans succeeded, where inflation hit its record and the local currency is devaluated to its maximum never seen before. However, the population did not surrender, and the U.S. failed in its attempt to break Lebanon's back. We cannot exclude the fact that in Lebanon, the U.S. has some influence over part of the leaders who still are afraid to say no to the Americans. This is why the Lebanese government has rejected deals offered by Russia and China to rebuild the local infrastructure, and were submitted to the U.S. will to refuse these offers, although the U.S. offered nothing. So what we have today is the American no strategy in Lebanon but to create a weak country without driving it to the edge of the abyss, but without pushing it to allowing the country to restore and to regain its strength. Because with a strong Lebanon, then Lebanon can say no to Israel and stand against the Israelis stronger than ever.
Okay. Now, Daniel, we've talked about several countries in the West Asia region and the U.S. foreign policy and how it's been working there. So if we want to just sum it up in a nutshell, what's the plan? What is it that Washington is trying to achieve in the West Asia region? Is it stability, instability? And any difference who is at the helm at the Oval Office, whether it's Biden or Trump or whoever?
The second question is a lot easier than the first. It does not make any difference who was at the helm, except for the fact that Donald Trump had been committed to more isolationist policies, and the Democrats turn out to be much more aggressive, much more imperialistic than the Republicans these days. So that is the big difference. But otherwise, empires run on oil, and they are all about exerting their power. Now, as to what the U.S. goals are in the Persian Gulf, essentially the U.S. policy is driven by Israel and Saudi Arabia. So the U.S. will do whatever those two countries wanted to. And even though the U.S. doesn't import very much oil from the Persian Gulf these days, if any, in fact, the U.S. wants to maintain control of the Persian Gulf because it believes that whoever controls Persian Gulf oil controls the global energy market. And so therefore, it doesn't want China or Russia from assuming that role. So the U.S. feels it's very important to maintain a finger in that pie, just to keep China out.
All right, Elijah, we have only 30 seconds for your final thoughts. Go ahead.
I think the Biden visit to the Middle East is going to be very poor. He is going to go back with a little bit of oil, but not what he dreams about. He is not the first to take a plane from Tel Aviv to Saudi Arabia, because Netanyahu did that in 2020, and he's not going to achieve what he declared about Iran or about the NATO, Arab NATO, or to bring countries together, whatever. He wants oil because he imposed sanctions on Russia that is hitting him and all his Western allies.
Okay, thank you so much. Elijah Magnier in Marseille, Daniel Lazare in New York. And thank you for watching this episode of The Spotlight. I'm Press Tabiab and your host, Behruz Najafi, and I'll see you next week.